This is episode 13 of a series where we examine the cut content, design, and development of Fallout Tactics. Several months into production, the designers at Forte ran into the first of many pitfalls, and the game was almost cancelled, as lead designer Ed Orman recounted. A few months into the development process, myself, the lead programmer Carl, and our producer at the time went with John D. Margaretti, head of Forte, to visit Interplay and discuss the project. Only once we got there did John realize how violent Fallout was, and John didn't like violence. So the night before we meet Interplay, it's suddenly starting to sound like the whole thing will fall through. Keep in mind that contracts have been signed, staffing plans submitted, and recruitment begun. Anyway, the meeting went ahead, and somehow the project kept going. Although it was because of this meeting that children were removed from the game. Fallout 1 and 2 were controversial internationally, and saw significant censorship across European localizations, having children's sprites removed entirely, among other changes. It's probably for the best that Killable Children were cut, as they probably wouldn't have added all that much to the overall experience, and likely would have been censored again in most regions. The game that they were making at this point in development was much different than what eventually shipped. Originally, there were plans for up to 18 side missions for extra experience and plot exposition that weren't essential to the completion of the game. Chris Taylor revealed why these side missions never made it in. At one point, we were going to include some optional missions. The game was going to be structured so as to allow for optional and required missions, just to make the mission's tree branches seem a little more full. We changed that and instead added more required missions. We changed it because we felt that we were including a lot of content that the players would never encounter. We felt that we also wouldn't be able to devote ourselves to designing each mission effectively. Also, we had already implemented random encounters, which really made these special missions obsolete anyway. It's unfortunate this change was made, as random encounters are one of the most frustrating aspects of tactics in my opinion. The randomized maps are often terrible to drive vehicles through, and their nature of being random doesn't really work well for a game based around tactical combat. Further, there are relatively few enemy types, which means you experience most of these encounters pretty quickly. Another early difference was they planned to include reactivity between missions, or as they called it, interwoven consequences. Apparently, they planned for the completion of a mission to affect the other missions in that stage of the campaign, but there's almost no reactivity across missions in the final game. This is probably one of the game's saddest cuts, as reactivity could have added a layer of strategy in terms of the order you attempted missions, and potentially given more weight to the mission's secondary objectives. There is references in the code to several Pipboy upgrades, and the first is the motion sensor from Fallout 1 and 2. In the first game, the motion sensor displayed all actors on the map you're currently in. In the second game, it showed the position of other characters, but also gave the player a 20% bonus to their outdoorsman skill, and it's possible it would have had both effects in tactics. There's also a few references to a Geiger counter, which would have displayed the amount of rads of the area you're in. When close to radiation, it would have told the player the Geiger counter is clicking. When close to high levels of radiation, a different message would be displayed: the Geiger counter is clicking wildly. The Brotherhood medic NPCs don't actually heal you, and Rad-X is expensive, which makes being irradiated an annoying condition to fix. The Geiger counter would have helped avoid getting radiation sickness in the first place, and could have been a great inclusion. In an earlier episode, I talked about cut holodisk, and there's also some unused messages for uploading their contents onto your Pip-Boy. These messages were: no relevant information found, information has been loaded to your Pip-Boy, and the information is already in your Pip-Boy. The designers could have included significantly more lore if holodisk were implemented, and it's too bad they never had the opportunity to finish this. To end this episode, we're going to take a look at a few interesting items that got the axe. There's a cut item called the audio amplifier, and its description reads, allows the user to perceive the movement of others around them to far greater ranges. Includes ear shield technology to prevent deafness from sudden excessive noise. This suggests that the audio amplifier would have allowed the player to detect enemies from further away, likely through walls and other obstacles that block line of sight, which would have been incredibly useful and perhaps even overpowered. There are 5 cut unique inventory icons for bracelet keycards, color-coded white, blue, red, green, and brown. It's difficult to say what these would have done. Notably, there are 5 Brotherhood of Steel locations in-game: Bunker Alpha, Beta, Delta, Epsilon, and Gamma. Perhaps the player originally needed these bracelets to gain access to each bunker, and would have been rewarded with one at the end of a stage of missions. Perhaps certain rooms inside the bunkers couldn't be accessed without them, and would have contained cool loot or special vendors. There's a cut torch item that would have allowed the player's squad to see further in dark areas. Its description suggests this effect wouldn't last long, and would have a long cooldown period before it could be turned on again. Its description reads, a torch creates light for a short period of time. Watch the batteries as a recharge is a long way away. I've mentioned this in a previous video, but there's night vision goggles in some of Tactic's concept art. Its in-game description would have read, a pair of infrared goggles. Should increase perception at night. Like the torch, this item was likely meant to incentivize starting missions at night. Playing at night affects the accuracy of both your squad and your enemies, but these items would have given the player an advantage. There are 2 cut items that originally appeared in Fallout 2, Brock Flower and Xander Root. Presumably these would have been used to craft healing powder like they were previously. There is no crafting system in the final game, so perhaps they considered one and cut it, or maybe you could give these items to the tribals that appear in the first bunker, and they would have given you healing powder in return. Finally, a whoopee cushion was shown in some early concept art, but never made it into the final game, and it's unclear what its purpose would have been. Perhaps it was simply a joke trap, though NPCs can't sit down in chairs, so I'm not sure how it would have been triggered. Some of these changes, particularly the addition of side missions and reactivity, would have made Fallout Tactics into an even better game. Ultimately though, all of this was left on the cutting room floor.